Also, obviously, the big issue of the day and what's happened today and yesterday, but in particular the attack on the synagogue in Melbourne, this firebombing, arson attack is what it seems to be, while people were actually inside. So Anthony Albanese condemning the attack, saying anti-Semitism, sadly, has been around for a long time, defending the government's record in terms of action that has been taken and increased security around, for example. To get more on this, let's go to my Sky News colleague, Sharri Markson. Thank you for your time. I guess, first of all, we saw the passion from the Jewish community. That was at the press conference there held earlier by Jacinta Allen, the Victorian Premier. There's been so many sort of flare-ups of anti-Semitism, it's maybe easy for some to forget how much of an escalation this is. This is a firebomb. When people were outside, they ran out as this place was lit up by people throwing accelerants in and then lighting it and running away.
Tom, it's impossible to overstate how devastating, how truly heart-wrenching this is for the entire Jewish community today across the country and, in fact, across the world. A synagogue, a Jewish place of worship, was firebombed, was set alight in Australia in 2024. Just the thought of it brings tears to my eyes. How can Jews in our country not be safe going to a synagogue? And Tom, you know, it's not an isolated incident, because just 2 days ago on Wednesday night, while I was going to air during my show, the Great Synagogue in Sydney was in lockdown because there were aggressive pro-Palestinian protests outside. We saw plans for another protest last week in Melbourne outside a synagogue. There hasn't been enough political leadership to say you cannot protest outside a synagogue. And so when there were 2 Jews arrested just 2 days ago outside the Great Synagogue, there were 2 Jews arrested for holding the Israeli flag outside the Great Synagogue, yet none of the protesters were arrested. And why were they protesting outside a synagogue? They shouldn't have been allowed to protest outside a Jewish place of worship. What can their protest be against? The Jewish people? This is un-Australian. But when no action is taken, then one thing leads to another, and you can see how a synagogue was then firebombed. Tom, we have not seen political leadership from the Prime Minister on this issue. I can't tell you how angry I am, truly angry, to hear him just say, as he did then, that anti-Semitism has been around for a long time, because that is abdicating his leadership on this issue. Since October 7, 2023, he is the Prime Minister. It is his responsibility, and fine, it's been around a long time, for thousands of years, but not in Australia, it hasn't, not in my lifetime. This is an unprecedented rise in Australia in anti-Semitism since October the 7th, 2023. It is on his watch. It is his responsibility to show leadership on it. He said the bare minimum on this issue over the past year. He hasn't shown leadership or strength, and that's why we end up in this situation right now, where a synagogue is firebombed.
In terms of the incidents that have happened and obviously flared up since October, is the concern not so much that any politician's ever saying, yes, great, there's obviously condemnation of it, but how much it's been able to maybe bubble away? And I think in particular of the universities and some of the long-running protests that were happening there, and people sort of went, well, oh, it's a passionate subject, we'll allow that to go, and how much that might have sort of culturally almost become acceptable in some eyes to target Jewish people. Now, people can have strong feelings, obviously, about the Gaza war, but it's the targeting of Jewish people here that seems unfathomable.
I couldn't agree more. And anti-Semitism has been tolerated. It has been condoned in Australia over the past 14 months. You're completely right. Everyone has a right to their own view on the Middle East, on Israel, on Netanyahu, but they don't have a right to target the Jewish community here in Australia or anywhere. We have been, up until the past 14 months, a successful multicultural society. Those Australian values of inclusion, of acceptance, of tolerance need to be protected. They haven't been fought for, and instead we've allowed pro-Hamas supporters to antagonise and intimidate the Jewish community. The vandalism has been intense. The Jewish community has been begging for leadership on this issue. We couldn't have begged more. We have begged for leadership. The ASIO has acknowledged that the threat, they increased the terror threat level some months ago in acknowledgement of this. But, you know, Anthony Albanese, the federal government, law enforcement just hasn't done enough. You know, I said to Peter Dutton, if he was Prime Minister, what would he do on this issue? And he said he would send the very clear message to law enforcement that racism, that hatred, that hate speech can't be tolerated, it can't be condoned. And I think that is one thing that has been terribly missing. I can't tell you how heartbroken I am, Tom, and I'm so fearful that it's just going to keep escalating unless really strong action is taken, unless the message is sent that this is not going to be tolerated. And also, you know, Albanese and Penny Wong need to tone their language down. We have Penny Wong out criticising Israel more than she criticises Hamas. She demands Israel recognise a Palestinian state. Where's her UN resolution for the hostages to be brought home? You know, it's an overemphasis, it's an obsession with criticising Israel, and there can be no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. Israel is fighting for its survival. It's trying to defend itself as it comes under terror attack. Hamas took the hostages. The war would have ended on October 8 if they would have returned the hostages. They still don't to this day. More than 100 innocent people, including a baby Kafir and his 4-year-old brother, who would be now 5, held captive by terrorists in Gaza.
Taken away in those terrifying pictures with their mother, of course, and no one knows what's happened to them. Looking at some of the protests over the past year, we've seen instances where people have had Hezbollah signage, Hamas signage, and even some of the ones on university campuses singling out Hamas terror fighters. I think sometimes when you look at the pictures, you think, do these people even know who this terror fighter is? Surely there's some sort of useful idiot, perhaps, to put the term out there. This sort of incident, though, makes you wonder if people out there actually believe in some of the signs that they're not just meant to be incendiary, but they're actually supporting Hamas in Australia.
Well, of course they are. Of course they are. We have seen clear support for terror groups like Hamas and Hezbollah here in Australia. I reported that one of the alleged perpetrators of that vandalism attack in Willara 2 weeks ago has a Hezbollah tattoo on his neck. That's what police are alleging. So there has been this support for terrorism. There's been this horrendous moral confusion. You know, Israel was attacked on October 7. 250 of its innocent people, they were dragged from their bed. Families, mostly children, the women and the elderly, were dragged, taken hostage. Thousands killed, hundreds gunned down at a music festival. This is what's happened. There's been a terror attack. Israel has been fighting for its survival ever since. And the reason this moral confusion has just increased, because it began with, you know, those horrendous groups of protests, but it's increased. It's because it hasn't been shut down by the government. And in fact, it's only been reinforced by statements that Penny Wong, our own foreign minister, has made. Tom, people are aghast at the horrific leadership we've had that has allowed anti-Semitism to fester and explode in Australia. The former Prime Ministers, Scott Morrison, Tony Abbott, utterly aghast. John Howard, aghast at the abysmal political leadership we've had here. This isn't the Australia anyone recognises, where a synagogue is firebombed. The Prime Minister can't dismiss this as it's been a problem for a long time. He cannot take that line, because we haven't had an anti-Semitism crisis in this country until October 7, 2023.
It's an interesting line. I know you're focusing on it. I'm sure it'll get a lot of attention. It does strike me. I mean, I remember visiting the Holocaust Museum in Melbourne as a student, and people didn't say, anti-Semitism, it's out there. It was more a case of, look what happens, I guess, if it's unchecked or if the world turns a blind eye. So explaining briefly, we're nearly out of time, Sharri, but is that comment going to be incendiary, do you think, saying, well, anti-Semitism's with us? Maybe it's stating the obvious, but does it hint, not that he's saying it's acceptable, but he's sort of like, well, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, I was blown away when he said that, when he just said, in answer to a question about the synagogue, yes, he condemned it, and then he said, anti-Semitism has been around for a long time. No, Prime Minister, it hasn't. Not in Australia, it hasn't. I never thought... I genuinely, Tom, I couldn't understand how we ended up with a situation like the Holocaust or like other persecutions, because I'd never known anti-Semitism as a Jew myself. We hadn't seen it in our community before October 7, 2023. And then it has only increased since then, and dramatically, month by month. And from the very start, from those Opera House protests on October 9th, we begged for leadership on this. We have begged for action on this before something terrible happens, and we are just seeing an escalation in incidents, and it's the horrifying reality of what's unfolding here.
Sharri Markson, thank you.
Thank you, Tom.